Welcome back, everyone. This is Sir Manatee, and this is the First Partition of Poland-Lithuania explained 1772. I'm Shields. This is what we do, react to history videos. So if you're new here, hi, how you doing? Yeah, we're gonna go through this video. We already did the prelude to this video. A lot of stuff went over my head. Not in terms of like I can't understand it. It's just like the language and the time period. It's just so new to me. So bear with me. I think I have more context now than I ever have. But let's jump right into it, shall we?
By World of Warships. It is late February 1768 in Bar, a small fortress town in Podolia in modern-day Ukraine. A group of disgruntled Polish nobles came together in order to proclaim an armed rebellion, a so-called confederation. They came from different noble factions, but generally speaking, they had the same goals. They wanted to defend their old privileges and rights, protect the Catholic Church, and most importantly, dethrone the new Polish king, Stanisław II August Poniatowski.
Yeah, they don't like him.
And kick out his Russian protectors. The nobles saw this insurrection as the last chance to break out of the political stalemate and to restore Poland to its former status as a great power. They had ample reasons to worry about the future of their state.
But it hasn't been a great power in decades.
But undoing the damage that had been inflicted on it over the course of the past half-century, both from within and the outside, was certainly not going to be an easy undertaking.
Yeah, mainly Russia, but mostly Russia and Prussia, and maybe a little bit of Austria.
I've already explained the story of the so-called Polish sovereignty crisis in my last video, which covers the entire period between the Swedish Deluge and the Bar Confederation in detail, but I'll present a short summary here to put everyone watching on the same page. In the late 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the largest states in Europe, had long ceased to be a sovereign power. Instead, it had gradually become dependent on its neighbouring countries of Austria, Prussia, and particularly Russia.
Yeah, specifically Russia, and Russia's gonna kind of like if you think of like a vassal state, they're not technically that yet, but they are almost that. They are obviously in the sphere of influence, whether it be by the king itself or just like the politics and the military prowess of Russia on their doorstep. They're also kind of like sandwiched between Prussia as well, which kind of creates like a continuation of like, what do I do?
The whole ordeal began during the Great Northern War, when Tsar Peter the Great intervened in
No, it's kind of blurry. We can't make it blurry. There we go.
A conflict between the Polish nobles and King Augustus II, who harboured absolutist tendencies. In the so-called pacification Sejm of 1717, the many privileges of the nobility, also known as the Szlachta, were guaranteed and the Polish army size was heavily restricted. Afterwards, Russian troops became a frequent sight in Poland-Lithuania as they would often be brought in as peacekeepers. Peter the Great had understood how he could use the flawed Polish political system to his full advantage. He knew that he could pit the various factions of the nobility against each other and thus keep the Commonwealth in an eternal political deadlock with no way out. To that end, he and his successors used a combination of bribery, blackmailing and open oppression. From that point on, Poland-Lithuania was to remain a weak buffer state along Russia's western border. In 1720, Russia signed a treaty with the Prussian king, and both countries agreed to work with one another to prevent any sort of reforms in Poland from taking place.
Yeah, like the veto issue, and then like there's the bureaucracy versus the king and like the confederations and all this different, like they basically want to keep it status quo as much as possible in the sake of like making sure that things do not move too radically, so you know their influence from outside within does not get squashed.
After Augustus II's death in 1733, a war of succession broke out. In the end, the candidate backed by Austria and Russia, Augustus III, prevailed.
Who would have thought?
Overall, the reign of Augustus III was marked by peace and a blossoming of the arts, but also by political irrelevance and stagnation. Any internal attempts at reform came to nothing. After the death of the king, Russia installed a new king, Stanisław August Poniatowski, who was supposed to be a powerless and obedient figurehead. But the new king and his supporters, mostly coming from the Czartoryski family, initiated a series of valuable reforms. Among them was a restriction of the liberum veto, the right of every deputy in the parliament to veto any legislation, which had proven to be extremely harmful when abused. Once again, Russia intervened after having stirred up religious turmoil, arrested the opposition, and forced the parliament to sign the so-called Eternal Treaty by threatening military force. In early 1768, this treaty came into effect, and it
Can you imagine signing an eternal treaty? Like, just the word itself just seems like, oh yeah, we're stuck here forever.
guaranteed the privileges of the nobility for all eternity.
Yeah.
Any reform was thus made completely impossible. And because this was a Polish-Russian treaty, Russia factually gained the right to intervene whenever it felt that the noble privileges were threatened. Poland-Lithuania had signed off its independence and become a Russian protectorate. It was the fact that this very treaty was going to be signed that inspired the rebellious nobles to meet in Bar and to put up resistance. These men, many of whom came from influential magnate families like the Potockis, the Sapieha and the Kraszinskis, were driven by a form of idealism and inspired to defend their political freedoms and to reverse the political subjugation to Russia. In many ways, the Bar Confederation can be considered an early point of reference for Polish nationalism, and during the 19th and 20th centuries, numerous Polish freedom fighters were inspired by its example. But before we go on to discuss the consequences of the Bar Confederation, a quick word from today's sponsor.
W World of Warships. Okay, Catherine the Great.
And play World of Warships today. For the Russian Empress, Catherine II, the outbreak of the Bar Confederation was troubling news. She had personally chosen Stanisław August Poniatowski as the new Polish king and had made sure that he would be installed. Furthermore, she and the Russian ambassador to Poland, Nikolai Rybnin, had done everything in their power to keep the ruling nobility in line and to establish unquestioned Russian dominance over the Commonwealth. In order to preserve her position, Catherine sent a contingent of Russian troops into Poland to crush the Bar Confederation. But we can't imagine the rebels have been a coherent and united force with a central leader. Inner tensions among the leadership quickly arose, and they prevented them from pursuing a systematic course of action. The rebels weren't really able to fight the Russian army one-on-one, so they had to resort to a type of guerrilla warfare instead. The uprising would prove to be very difficult to suppress, and this conflict, which also saw a brutal peasant and Cossack uprising, would last several years. What is more, Catherine had to divert most of her
To the Ottomans.
capable troops to the south, as the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople had decided to use Russia's moment of weakness to declare war. The Confederacy claimed to be the only legal representative of the Polish state and created a formal governing body in 1769 called the Generality.
Okay, so it is it is so fragmented right now. My goodness, this is the weakest it has been so far.
They frequently changed their base of operation, but stayed mostly in the Austro-Polish border area.
Okay.
They even began to send diplomats to the courts of Constantinople, Paris, Vienna, Potsdam and Dresden in order to seek recognition abroad. For King Stanisław August Poniatowski, the situation was a dilemma. Initially, he and his supporters had actually asked Russia to crush the Bar uprising for them because the Polish army was simply unable to do so. The king sensed that his opposition among the Szlachta was growing and that he became increasingly reliant on his Russian protectors. In return, the Russian diplomats in Warsaw expected that he and his supporters from the Czartoryski family fully aligned themselves with the interests of Empress Catherine. Still, the king and the Czartoryskis tried to use the opportunity that the Russo-Turkish War presented
to re-establish, because there's like a subjugation almost to Catherine. He doesn't like that.
Undo some of the damages that the Eternal Treaty had inflicted and to revoke the Russian constitutional guarantee. But to Catherine, this was unacceptable. After all, she had invested large amounts of time, effort and especially money to put Stanisław August on the throne and to turn the Commonwealth into an obedient puppet state. Meanwhile, the conflict with the Barists went on. In October 1770, the Generality formally endorsed a declaration to dethrone Poniatowski, which made any sort of rapprochement impossible. In November 1771, a group of Confederates even managed to kidnap the king and attempted to force his abdication, but Stanisław August pulled off a lucky escape. As the conflict...
How are we just going to skip over that like that? They kidnapped him? How did he escape? Lucky.
It raged on, the Russian Empire had slowly managed to gain the upper hand over the Turks,
I'm guessing this is in the Black Sea. Irrelevant, but part of history.
and the Ottoman Empire suffered one military defeat after another. With the Ottomans on the back foot, the Russians once again turned their attention to the Polish rebels. After 1771, the Barist fortresses were besieged and subsequently conquered. The last center of resistance, the monastery of Jasna Góra in Częstochowa, was only taken in August 1772. Even though the Confederation of Bar is generally regarded as the precursor to the First Partition of Poland, this path was by no means inevitable. Catherine's failure to keep Poland under control, the brutal conflict with the Confederation and the intervention of the Ottomans did not create a situation that would change anything in the relationship between Poland-Lithuania and its neighbouring countries. It was only through the targeted influence of Prussian and Austrian politics that partition became a viable option.
Okay.
The interest of Austria, which at the time was ruled by Maria Theresia and her son Joseph II, is quite easy to deduce.
What do you mean? Wait. Back up 1 second. Are we talking about different eras? Because Maria Theresa is absolute ruler, right? Why is Joseph II? Unless we're talking about a certain era. I can't remember. Or do they share power? And I'm just mistaken.
Firstly, Vienna wanted to finally disrupt the dominance of Russia and Prussia over Central and Eastern Europe, which had been in place since the 1720s.
And didn't they really care more about Silesia? And wasn't that squashed because of Frederick the Great by way of Peter III?
Furthermore, the definitive loss of Silesia to Prussia in the Seven Years' War, an incredibly valuable province with a high population, many natural resources and an advanced industry, was painful alongside the humiliation that the defeat in 3 successive wars to a vastly smaller country like Prussia naturally incurs.
I mean, it's Frederick the Great, though. Like, if you're going to lose, I'd lose to him.
So, ever since 1763, the Habsburg monarchy has sought adequate territorial compensation. Joseph and Maria Theresia did not really concern themselves with who would bear the cost of this compensation, and Vienna's policy was not fundamentally directed against Poland-Lithuania. This is what differentiated the Austrian rulers from the Prussian king, who unavoidably sought to expand his power at the expense of the Commonwealth.
And Prussia's very small relative to like the two other powers of Russia and Austria-Hungary. Or the Austrian Habsburg Empire, depending on what you want to call it. The Prussia's also kind of like pocketed. It's not all connected. So there's like a lesser Prussia or greater or Eastern Prussia. I can't remember what it's called, but there's like an Eastern Prussia or a Greater Prussia, and they're not connected too. So Prussia needs more cohesion within their territory. I'm guessing Austria is more or less looking to save face because of their failures in Silesia, more or less because of Frederick the Great and Russia's co-alliance in that particular region to squash Austria.
At that time, Prussia was ruled by King Frederick II, who is easily one of the most fascinating characters in early modern European history, and he was as intelligent and cunning as he was cynical and cold-blooded. Already in 1752, he claimed, not entirely without reason, that Poland was merely enjoying an artificial existence tolerated by its neighbours.
Yeah, poor Poland.
The Commonwealth would only exist for as long as the neighbouring powers still considered it useful. In the end, however, it would come down to partition. He had long hoped to incorporate...
Yeah, this is what I mean. Look at this. It's all over the place. You got the Silesian area down there, which is originally Austrian, but then you have all these other like little pockets like Magdeburg, Ham, which is, I think that's Hamburg, right? And then Minden, Emden, Kleve, Königsberg, Tilsit, which is like, isn't that Lithuanian territory? So yeah, it's crazy. Just think about all this land right here. It's just so pocketed. They definitely want expansion in the way that where they can have more cohesiveness with their empire, but also they want to expand. They're very militarized people. If you're watching this, you know this stuff, so I'm just repeating what you know.
Incorporate Polish Prussia, and to finally gain a continuous land connection between the capital Berlin and East Prussia.
Yes.
In his political testament, he set out his precise ideas. It would perhaps be better to gain this land piece by piece through negotiation than through the right of conquest. In any case, where Russia urgently needed our assistance, it might be possible to have Thorn, Elbing and the surrounding area ceded to us, thereby gaining a connection from Pomerania to the Vistula. Even though Prussia was allied to Russia, Frederick watched St. Petersburg's increasing influence over Poland and the Eternal Treaty with unease, but there was little he could do to stop it. He became even more unsettled when Empress Catherine became embroiled in the Polish Civil War and waged war against the Ottomans. This was because, in the event of an Austrian intervention, Prussia would have been contractually obliged to support Russia, and indeed Austria began to provide diplomatic support to the Ottoman Empire and show sympathy for the Bar Confederation. When Russia then began to prevail in the conflict with the Turks and announced that it wanted to annex the duchies of Moldavia and Wallachia, Austrian entry into the war
otherwise known as Moldova today,
became increasingly likely. From Vienna's point of view, the Empress must not be allowed to further increase her influence in Europe. Frederick, however, was determined to prevent another major war, as the 7 Years' War had ended only a few years ago and had brought Prussia to the brink of destruction. So he had to find a way to satisfy the wishes of all three parties. His suggestion was a partition of the Polish state. That way, a new balance of power could be established, which pleased Austria, a war could be avoided and new territory could be gained, which pleased Prussia, and Russia could be compensated with Polish land for leaving Moldavia and Wallachia with the Turks. The cynical plan to carve up Poland-Lithuania in order to clear the differences between Russia, Austria and Prussia was one that only someone like Frederick could come up with. In Frederick's worldview, individual people have to subordinate themselves to the interests of the state, and territorial expansion through important areas which benefit that state is the top priority. What the inhabitants of these areas, who also happened to live in a dysfunctional state, thought about this was of no significance to him.
So it doesn't matter. There's a supremacy bias here for sure.
The partition plan was floated to St. Petersburg in February 1769, but the Russian foreign...
Wait, this is not even the Winter Palace? This is Catherine Palace? My God, the wealth of Russia is unmatched. Maybe it's not unmatched. Have you seen Vienna, but or Paris? But it is insane to see all these palaces. Just think about the wealth inequality at this time in a place like Russia. Woo.
The minister showed little interest. So instead, Frederick approached Austria in the hopes of normalizing the relations between the two countries and get past the bone of contention that the Prussian conquest of Silesia presented. In August 1769, Frederick II and Joseph II met in the Silesian city of Neisse or Nyssa. Both agreed to remain neutral in the Russo-Turkish War and to make sure that it didn't spread to Western Europe. By seeking talks with the emperor, Frederick wanted to put pressure on Catherine and to show her that she couldn't take the alliance with Prussia for granted. Catherine gave in and their alliance was formally prolonged until 1780. Even though it was Frederick who insisted most strongly on the annexation of territories, it was the two Austrian rulers who took the first bite out of the Polish cake. Just a few weeks before the meeting of Joseph and Frederick in Neisse, Austria occupied large parts of the Spiš, which is an area in modern-day Slovakia. In particular, it was a number of small Polish exclaves, which had been mortgaged to Poland by the Hungarian king to finance his war against Venice in the early 15th century.
Dang, we're going way back.
Now, during this time of Polish civil war, Vienna seized its chance. Under the pretext of protecting the border against the plague and against Confederate incursions, Maria Theresia ordered the military occupation of these exclaves. Later, a Hungarian bureaucrat was sent to the area to figure out where the border between Poland and Austria should run. Using a number of questionable documents, he reported that since the 15th century, Poland had gradually shifted the border to the south and had thus acquired more than they were actually entitled to. Despite the lack of
Says who?
a legal basis, Joseph urged that further territories along the border areas should be annexed. And so, in 1770, the border was forcibly moved to the north, and the Starostwa of Nowy Targ, Chorzyn, and Stary Sącz were incorporated into the Habsburg Empire. Although the Polish king protested vigorously against this violation of his borders, he was unable to do anything about it. By occupying these territories, Austria ultimately set a precedent that made further annexations at Poland's expense no longer unthinkable. Frederick followed the example of the annexation of the Spiš and ordered the military occupation of large areas of Greater Poland and Pomerania. He too used the protection of the
And what is Poland's response to all of this?
border and prevention of the plague as a pretext. Prussia thus occupied parts of a state with which it was not at war, and with which it formally maintained good relations. The occupation was devastating for the local population. There was looting and requisitioning
Yeah, that's just all the civilians always are going to get the worst of the worst here.
by the Prussian army. Thousands of people were deported to Prussia, and around 2 million thalers were stolen as compensation for expenses. In order to make his partition plan for Russia more palatable, Frederick sent his brother, Prince Henry, to St. Petersburg in October 1770. Henry was a skilled diplomat and, moreover, popular with Catherine. Frederick had granted him extensive freedom of action and instructed him to carefully explore the opportunities. Ultimately, however, it was the escalation of hostilities between Russia and Austria which paved the way to partition. Still determined to keep the Empress away from Moldavia and Wallachia, Vienna increasingly pursued a confrontational course from 1771 onwards. This was to culminate in an Austro-Ottoman alliance convention in the summer, which however was never ratified. It was an open threat. Frederick and Prince Henry now deliberately played with the possibility of Austrian intervention in the Russo-Turkish War. This was intended not only to strengthen Catherine's willingness to compromise, but also to reinforce Frederick's role as a mediator and an ally. In view of the failure of Russia's protectorate policy in Poland, the rapprochement between Prussia and Austria, and the threat of Austrian intervention, Catherine saw no other choice but to accept Frederick's proposal. On the 19th of February 1772, Prussia and Russia signed a bilateral partition treaty. At first, Maria Theresia was reluctant to participate in the partitions and protested vigorously against the injustice.
In very different politics between her and her son, Joseph II. Joseph II's a little bit more adamant, it seems.
Ultimately, however, her son Joseph, supported by the influential state chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, prevailed. It would be impossible to prevent Catherine and Frederick from carrying out their plans anyway, and it would be better to participate rather than
Yeah, I mean, they're going to do it either way. Might as well get a piece of the pie.
leave Poland-Lithuania solely to Prussia and Russia.
Yeah.
The three partitioning powers then marched into the territories they had claimed. On the 2nd of August, 1772, the partition treaty between Russia, Prussia, and Austria was finally signed in St. Petersburg,
And, like, what do you do if you're Poland?
thereby settling all border issues. When the negotiations were finished, Frederick noted his experience. Catherine and I are simply brigands, but I wonder how the Queen Empress, that is Maria Theresia, managed to square her confessor. She cried when she took, and the more she cried, the more she took.
Oh my gosh. Basically saying that they're crocodile tears.
In terms of territory, Russia received the highest share. It annexed all lands north of the Daugava River, including the town of Dynaburg or Daugavpils. Russia also received the counties of Polotsk, Vitebsk, and Mstisław. In total, the Russian Empire grew by about 92,000 square kilometers, an area inhabited by roughly 1.3 million people. In a way, Catherine got a raw deal, as even though the land was clearly vast, it was very underdeveloped, economically speaking, and sparsely populated.
Well, that's you can look at it that way, but you also can look at it like all this vast territory that can be populated, and a lot of your citizens. Obviously, Russia's huge anyway, so they don't have like a population problem. But this is going to give them more ample territory to eventually, terraform and so forth.
Owing to their good bargaining position,
But
Maria
yeah.
Theresia and Joseph II achieved a much better land grab. They got roughly the same amount of territory, but double the population. The Habsburg Empire
Yeah, because you got Krakow here, which is, I think they have Krakow unless it's in the green. I can't tell. They got a ton of territory in terms of like the cities and the metros.
annexed parts of Lesser Poland alongside Red Ruthenia and extended so far that it bordered the old Polish capital of Kraków. This land was incredibly valuable, as it was one of the most densely populated agrarian areas in Europe. It also included the historic city of Lwów, Lviv or Lemberg, and the valuable salt mines at Wieliczka and Bochnia. Arguably, Prussia was the largest beneficiary, even though its land gain was the smallest. Frederick gained most of Polish Prussia as
And then more coastal territory, and then connects to Eastern Prussia. Yeah, Frederick, you could say, is the winner here.
well as large parts of Greater Poland and Kuyavia. Danzig or Gdańsk remained a Polish exclave along the Baltic coast.
Hmm.
Not only had Frederick finally gained a direct land connection between East Prussia and Brandenburg, he had also annexed what was arguably the most economically important area of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was densely populated, prosperous, heavily urbanized, and included the valuable trading city of Elbing or Elbląg. All in all, the Commonwealth lost 27.8% of its territory.
So, like, that's one thing I originally thought, which is 100% not true. They did not take the whole. They didn't take everything. Obviously, you can see all this area in green is still Poland, right?
And 38.6% of its population. In the Partition Treaty, the robbery was justified with a cynical preamble to appease the conscience of the rulers who divided Poland among themselves. In the name of the Most Holy Trinity, the spirit of faction, the troubles and intestine war which had shaken the Kingdom of Poland for so many years, and the anarchy which acquires new strength every day, give just apprehension for expecting the total decomposition of the state. At the same time, the powers neighbouring on the Republic are burdened with rights and claims which are as ancient as they are legitimate.
Wow, burdened with the claims. Oh, we have to do it.
But in fact, there was no justification for the partition other than greed and opportunism.
Yeah. As most partitions are.
At most, in the case of Prussia, one could maybe still speak of security interests, although this did not serve as an official justification. Instead, numerous Prussian documents formulated elaborate claims that were supposed to confirm a Brandenburgian right to West Prussia that allegedly dated back centuries. It is doubtful, however, that anyone in the Prussian government took those seriously. Later, nationalist German historians often attempted to justify the partition by arguing that West Prussia and the Netze district were areas predominantly populated by German Protestants.
Oh, we've heard that before. That's literally what Putin's doing today. You know, they're Russian speaking. Let's just take it over. Well, I mean, should Portugal just invade Brazil?
While it is true that there was a significant presence of German speakers in these areas in the late 18th century, this explanation
Language does not equal. Come on.
makes no sense if you know anything at all about Frederick. The Prussian king was a Francophile, almost exclusively spoke French in daily life, and despised contemporary German culture.
Really? That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Moreover, he believed in the primacy of the Prussian state, not the German nation, and any kind of ethnic considerations were far from his mind.
I mean, Austria doesn't speak Austrian. They speak German. So that's an interesting, like, I didn't know that.
In general, it can be said that the partitioning powers justified their actions by claiming that they were actually doing the population in the occupied territories a favour. In enlightened 17th and 18th century societies, the image of Poland-Lithuania was extremely negative and filled with contempt. The Commonwealth was seen as a state ruled by anarchy. The Polish nobles were often described as wasteful, ignorant and selfish brutes who abused the serfs on their lands, and the Polish cities were considered to be dilapidated.
And that would make Russia what?
It is around that time that the term Polish economy became commonly used in the German-speaking lands to describe a chaotic and dysfunctional system of governance. Those stereotypes stuck around persistently and, unfortunately, are still very much present in the mind of many Western Europeans.
Really?
And so it is not surprising that
I've never heard that term, but I don't live in Europe either.
supporters of the Enlightenment in Prussia heavily cheered for the partition. They saw in it the advancement of enlightened German thinking and urged the local population to be grateful. In Warsaw, there was nothing that the Polish king Stanisław August could do to stop the partition from happening. The small, disorganized, underpaid and demotivated bunch that called itself the Polish army was powerless against the forces of the three partitioning powers. Apart from a few cases of local resistance, Austrian, Prussian and Russian forces marched in without problems. The Polish diplomats attempted to get support from the other European powers, but they didn't get much apart from reserved expressions of sympathy. The British government under Frederick North showed no interest in getting involved.
I mean, they got their hands full over in America.
In France, the situation was taken a bit more seriously, and the French foreign minister, the Duke of Aiguillon, urged the British to work together to restrain Russia's growing influence, but it ultimately came to nothing. France quickly accepted the new status quo in Central Europe. When the engraver Noël Lemire published his famous caricature of the Partitions, The Cake of Kings in 1773, its distribution was promptly banned by the French government. After all, Austria was an ally of France, and in this absolutist monarchy, kings and queens were above criticism.
For now.
The Poles were on their own. In Warsaw, the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian ambassadors presented a note to the king demanding an extraordinary Sejm session to ratify the partition to legalize them in Polish law. The partitioning powers then had to make sure that the envoys of the Sejm were compliant. Austrian, Russian, and Prussian army contingents were set up around the Sejmic venues, which were local parliaments where the deputies were elected, and a common corruption fund was set up in case some local nobles needed a bit more encouragement. They also
So a lot of bribes.
threatened the influential magnates who owned properties in the annexed territories with coercive measures like confiscation of their estates. No Sejmiki were allowed to be held in the partitioned territories. As a result of these measures, only a fraction of the regular number of representatives arrived at Warsaw to partake in the Sejm, and those who did were politically numbed, intimidated, or on a payroll by the foreign powers. And so the infamous Partition Sejm began in April 1773. It had been declared a confederated Sejm, which meant that decisions were made by majority vote and not unanimously as was usually the case. One of the marshals of the Sejm, Adam Poniński, was a willing enforcer of St. Petersburg's demands, received a salary of 3,000 ducats a month from Russia, and was rewarded with the post of Grand Treasurer in exchange for managing the confirmation of the treaties. There was never any doubt about how this Sejm would end. The king eventually joined the Confederation too, and a commission was formed to deal with all matters the partition entailed. Finally, in September 1773, the 3 treaties of cession between the Commonwealth and each of the partitioning powers were completed and signed off. It was a macabre spectacle in which the victim had to surrender a large part of his territory as part of a solemn ceremony.
Well, what's the other choice? They don't have a military. Oh, one that could be worthy to do anything here, right? They don't have a military. They don't have a centralized power. If they do, you could say they have a centralized power, but it's so volatile itself that you don't really have overall, majority of support. No, there's barely any nationalism here. Like, there's no nationalism at large. There's probably pockets of nationalism, but because of the deconstructed nationalism or Polish identity, Polish-Lithuanian identity, and because of the confederations that are continuously part of the zeitgeist of your politics, and then that coupled with your military inferiority, what do you do?
The First Partition of Poland was carried out with little bloodshed and
At this point, you better just be glad that you're still breathing.
by seemingly legal means. For Poland-Lithuania, it was doubly humiliating that the partition was made possible solely by the extensive collaboration of many Poles. In the decades leading up to the partition, numerous influential nobles and clergymen placed themselves in the service of neighbouring great powers, be it out of greed, selfishness, or short-sighted ignorance. During the entire Partition Sejm of 1773, only a handful of men voiced outrage and actively protested. One of them was Kajetan Sołtyk, the Bishop of Kraków and a senator. He had been one of the leading opponents of Nikolai Repnin, the Russian ambassador to Poland, who had spurred up religious revolts and used them to turn the
He's one of the people that... He's one of the architects of this partition, by the way.
Commonwealth into a Russian protectorate in 1767. For that, Sołtyk had been arrested and sent to Russia. He was released just in time to partake in the Partition Sejm, but quickly resigned. He wrote to the Russian ambassador, "I would rather sit in a dungeon and cut off my hand than sign the sentence passed on my fatherland. A Pole who permits the partition of his country would be sinning against God."
Okay, we got some nationalism. It's like I said, there are pockets of it. There's no centralized cohesion of this nationalism at hand, and if there is, it's not being shown. It's in the dark.
And we senators would become perjurers. The most famous case of resistance was that of Tadeusz Rejtan, the deputy from the constituency of Nowogródek, or Nowogródok in modern-day Belarus. After having failed to convince the other deputies to reject the partition, he tore his shirt, threw himself on the floor, blocked the exit and exclaimed, "On the blood of Christ, I adjure you, do not play the part of Judas. Kill me, stamp on me, but do not kill the fatherland." After the end of the partition Sejm, he resigned from political life and committed suicide a few years later. With that, the First Partition of Poland was completed. But what did the partitioning powers do with the territories they had acquired? Let's start with Prussia. The area that Prussia had annexed was quickly renamed to West Prussia. This term did not exist previously, it was artificially introduced and only used officially after the partition. For Frederick, the acquisition of Polish Prussia meant a huge boost in prestige because now he could finally call himself King of Prussia rather than just King in Prussia. The process of establishing an administrative apparatus and taxation policy in the territory had been underway for a long time, ever since Prussia had occupied large parts of the country in 1770, under the pretext of protecting it from the plague. Prussian statesmen and officials quickly developed a sense of superiority and saw themselves as part of a civilizing mission. In a letter to his friend Voltaire, Frederick wrote, "The Polish provinces cannot be compared to any state in Europe. They can only be compared to Canada."
What? What are you talking about?
He also compared the Poles to Native Americans, referring
I don't get it.
to them as Hurons or Iroquois. Although it may be tempting at first glance to see the Prussian perception of the Poles as an inferior and uncivilized people as a precursor to the Germanization policy of the late German Empire, or even the attempted...
Help me out there. What does that mean that he's comparing himself to Canada? I don't understand. In contemporary time, Canada is just more or less a protectorate, or what do you would call it? A colony of Britain, and the Iroquois or Confederation that are living, within British occupied North America. I'm confused there though.
Destruction of the Polish nation by the National Socialists, this comparison is not appropriate. The Prussian sense of superiority was by no means based on a nationalistic or ethnic worldview that regarded the Poles as inherently inferior. Instead, the Prussians thought in terms of the Enlightenment and considered Polish...
They think of meritocracy, supremacy?
structures and institutions to be outdated and inefficient. The Poles were therefore to be educated in the Prussian sense of the Enlightenment.
Okay.
After the partition, Prussian state...
Yeah, especially if you're like really BFFs with Voltaire, you're going to have very pretentious idealism when it comes to other nations around you.
State machinery quickly got to work. The German language was mandated for official communication, and all Polish legal customs were abolished in favor of Prussian ones.
So basically genocide. Okay.
Frederick himself showed great interest in his newly acquired province, and frequently issued instructions to transform it according to his ideas. Once a year he undertook an inspection tour of West Prussia and inquired about the conditions there. He met with representatives from the administration and inspected the expansion of the fortress near Gradens or Grudziądz. In order to strengthen the province economically, he promoted the targeted settlement of skilled workers in the cities of West Prussia. A total of 11,000 people were involved, most of them from Württemberg, Saxony, the Palatinate, or even Poland itself. All in all, large amounts of money were invested into West Prussia. Cities like Bromberg or Bydgoszcz and Kulm or Chełmno were financially supported, swamps were drained, forests were cut to gain new agricultural land, and a canal was built which created a direct connection for trade ships between the Oder and the Vistula River. Frederick also ordered the cultivation of fruit plants and, of course, potatoes, the building of dikes, and the construction of schools. The relationship between farmers and landowners was reorganized, and independent legal bodies provided farmers with better protection against arbitrary rule.
I mean, I'm sure besides the assimilation, there were good things, and I'm not saying assimilation is good at all. I'm saying there's probably some good things that were introduced, but the overall pretext is pretty bad.
An extensive tax system was introduced, which placed a greater burden on the population in the previous system, but was more evenly distributed. Overall, the Prussian rulers succeeded in winning the loyalty of their inhabitants. Only a small portion of the Polish nobility had refused to swear allegiance.
By the way, was there mass like refugees in this? That's one thing we haven't talked about yet. Like, what's the refugee status of the partitioned areas?
To the Prussian king in Marienburg or Malbork in 1772, and there was never any open, organized opposition. This did nothing to change Frederick's contempt for the Polish nobility. Catholic nobles had to pay higher taxes than the Protestant counterparts, were not allowed to form district assemblies, and were prohibited from establishing their own credit institutions. Land-owning nobles who had owned property in both Prussia and Poland-Lithuania were given the choice in 1777 of either settling exclusively in Prussia or losing their Prussian lands. However, this ultimatum was never enforced, and it became apparent that Frederick's policy was mainly directed against the influential magnates who were politically active in Poland.
So basically anyone that could, rival power.
Frederick was far less hostile towards the lower nobility. Overall, the West Prussian Protestants, who lived mainly in the cities, were quickly integrated. The process proved somewhat more difficult for the Catholics, despite assurances that they would be allowed to continue to practice their faith freely. The nobility remained suspicious, but at the same time, many, especially among the lower nobility, seized opportunities for advancements that had never before been available. Many attended the new cadet school in Kulm, pursued military careers, and some proudly added a German surname to their Polish one. Some examples of this would be Rosenberg-Groszczynski, Bach-Zelewski, or Heuke-Troszczynski. While the people of West Prussia witnessed a period of modernization and amelioration as a result of the partition, the people of the coastal city of Danzig or Gdańsk experienced a time of severe hardship.
Why? I would imagine they would get more benefit than anyone.
As was agreed by the partitioning powers, Danzig remained a part of the Commonwealth and its citizens remained loyal to the Polish crown.
That's why they're cut off.
Danzig should actually have retained parts of its surrounding area, but Prussian troops advanced right up to the city limits. It was particularly devastating that they also occupied the northern districts of Neufahrwasser and Westerplatte, thereby controlling imports and exports between Danzig and the Baltic Sea. What followed was a period of harassment. Ships sailing to Danzig had to unload their goods for inspection and were charged Prussian import duties of between 30 and 40%. Frederick's plan was to divert trade on the Vistula to the now
So basically they're strangling them.
Prussian city of Elbing, which he succeeded in doing. The people of Danzig tried to fight back against the customs war with their fleet, but it was futile. In just 20 years, the value of imports to Danzig fell by 2/3 and exports by half.
Yeah, I mean, the margins are so bad that people are going to go elsewhere just because they're going to see the trend.
Numerous businesses in the city received no more orders and went bankrupt. Overall, the population of this once thriving city fell from about 60,000 to 35,000 during this period. But it was not only traders who suffered from the customs regulations, but also citizens who wanted to cross the border into the surrounding area. So-called coffee sniffers, Prussian customs officials, meticulously checked all carriages for dutiable goods, which was an enormously humiliating experience. The Prussians even went so far as to found the Royal Prussian immediate city of Stolzenberg in the south of Danzig from several former suburbs, solely subordinate to Frederick and endowed with market rights. The aim was to compete with the Danzig market and attract Danzig craftsmen, but
Might as well just took it. Like, what's the point of having the city there? Like, it's just... why would you just take it? Like, the optics are worse in this case than if you did take it.
this was only partially successful. The people of Danzig often attempted to reach a reconciliation with the Prussian king, but without success. He wanted to annex the Polish exclave, or at least eliminate it as a commercial competitor. Even
Yeah, you probably couldn't, like, in the negotiations, they probably, like, he couldn't get this, so this is his alternative. Sore loser, is what I would say.
after Frederick's death, the harassment continued, and only ended after the city was ceded to Prussia in the course of the Second Partition of Poland in 1793. Now, let's look at Austria. With the partition of Poland, the Habsburg Empire gained a very valuable piece of land, inhabited by almost 2.5 million people, most of them Poles, Ruthenians, and Jews. Together with the areas Austria had annexed in 1770, the region was renamed to Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, with Lemberg being its provincial capital. The area was quickly incorporated into the centralized system of government that Austria had. In particular, it was the Minister of State, Johann Anton von Pergen, who insisted on accelerating the process. He held a very critical view on Polish administration and society and saw the local nobles as uneducated, greedy, selfish, and alcoholic. Establishing an administration that retained the existing rulers and institutions was never an option for Pergen. In October 1773, a patent was issued abolishing the old form of government and dismissing all voivodes and castellans. In addition, the privileges of the Schlachter were significantly restricted. From then on, Galicia was ruled by an Austrian governor, who was tasked with establishing the administrative apparatus. Shortly after the annexation, Joseph II travelled through Galicia to inspect the country against his mother's advice. The journey lasted 6 weeks, during which time the enlightened emperor realized that the peasants there were living in terrible conditions and that urgent reforms were necessary.
Well, that's a good thing. Yeah, don't always listen to your mom. Not always. This right here is a good example why you should definitely inspect your subjects, because they're subjects at this point. You have to understand that they're going to you gotta. I'm glad that they did go on that tour, because will he, I don't know if he will he bring good reforms, or will he not bring good reforms? Let's find out.
After his return, Galicia-Lodomeria became a testing ground for Joseph's ambitions. In
Because he had a lot of ambition.
1775, a new administrative order for Galicia was issued, which reorganized the province and curtailed the privileges of the Polish nobility. The traditional equality within the nobility was abolished and replaced by a hierarchical system based on the Austrian model. In addition, tax exemption for nobles was abolished, even though their tax burden was still lower than that of the rest of the population. As part of the constitution, a provincial parliament was established in Lemberg, where the local nobles gathered.
That's so crazy awesome that a lot of these buildings are still standing today.
However, it had only limited powers and could not challenge the essential decisions made in Vienna. In order to integrate Galicia, an extensive civil service was quickly established, and soon thousands of civil servants from German-speaking areas flocked to the province to build a new life and to administer the newly created districts. Of particular importance to Joseph was the situation of the farmers who worked the land of the local nobility, because during his journey he had personally witnessed their daily hardships.
Okay, so he's a man of the people. Not excusing the partition, but this is good. It's good optics.
First, a number of laws were enacted that restricted some of the oppressive measures taken by landowners. For example, their farmers were allowed to lodge complaints with the district administration in the event of unfair punishment, and any corvée services had to be entered in a register, otherwise they were illegal. The introduction of new corvées was also forbidden. But it was only after the beginning of Joseph II's sole reign that the situation significantly changed for the peasants, because in 1781, the centuries-old tradition of serfdom in Galicia was abolished.
It'll take like another 100 years for Russia to do that.
From then on, the peasants
Maybe not 100.
Were no longer the property of the landowner, but were merely in a relationship of dependency. They were allowed to leave the manor, marry independently, and their sons were permitted to learn the trade in the city. In addition, the number of corvée labor duties was significantly reduced, and the landlords lost their right of jurisdiction. These and other far-reaching reforms were instrumental in freeing the peasants from serfdom and ensured the Habsburg Empire the loyalty of its peasantry. This was entirely in line with Joseph's intentions, who hoped that these reforms would improve the economy of Galicia. Improved living conditions would enable the peasants to work more efficiently, which would generate additional taxes and thus enhance the power of the monarchy. As you might imagine, these reforms weren't enthusiastically welcomed by the nobles, but they never practiced widespread opposition either. For the most part, they came to terms with the new circumstances. But after the death of Joseph II in 1790, the leaders of the Galician nobility sent a long petition of grievances to the court in Vienna.
Magna Carta of Galicia.
In it, they criticized the centralization of the province, the abolition of serfdom, the imposition of Austrian law, and the introduction of German as the language of administration. Despite all this, they never questioned the legitimacy of Austrian rule and recognized Leopold II as their rightful monarch. Especially the younger generations of Polish nobles did not consider Austrian rule to be such a bad thing in principle, and made use of their newly gained possibilities. For example, Lemberg became an important centre of learning and culture. Just 2 decades after the partition, hundreds of students studied at the newly founded University of Lemberg and enjoyed an excellent education. Others enjoyed the theatre pieces that the new theatre in the city had to offer. All in all, a special relationship
There's a lot of progressive actions happening, okay.
arose between the Galician nobility and the Habsburg state, mostly marked by cooperation and mutual understanding. Now, let's finally switch to the Russian Empire.
Probably, I'm not gonna say, actually, yeah, we're gonna say probably the worst of the 3 when it comes to, so who's your ruler? Prussia, okay. What about you? Austria, not bad. What about you? Russia. Damn.
As the Russo-Turkish War was coming to an end, major social unrest caused a large-scale uprising in the Volga and Ural regions. This was called the Pugachev Rebellion, and it mobilized large layers of peasants, Cossacks, and many other social groups. After the rebellion was finally crushed, Catherine went about to reform the administrative system of the empire in order to make sure that the power of the governors and the gentry was strengthened and that such a peasant uprising won't happen again. With the reform of 1775, the Russian governorates were divided into provinces according to extensive population statistics. The governorates were not created with regard to economic, ethnic, or political considerations, and each had a population between 300,000 and 400,000 people. And so the territories annexed from Poland-Lithuania were reorganized in a centralized manner following the reform. Most of these lands ended up in the Polotsk Governorate, later renamed to the Viceroyalty of Polotsk. The formerly Lithuanian lands were quickly integrated into the Russian administrative system, and Catherine was so confident in her reform that no preparatory phase was granted to them. The governing institutions that had previously existed in the Duchy of Lithuania were mercilessly abolished and not even kept provisionally. They were ruled just like every other governorate in the empire. Catherine had pursued such an unconditional policy of state centralization for over a decade, as is apparent in the secret instructions which she gave to General Prosecutor Alexander Wyazemski after his appointment. Little Russia, which means Belarus, Livonia and Finland, Karelia, are provinces governed according to confirmed privileges, the violation of which is inappropriate. But it would be wrong to call them foreign or treat them as such. This could certainly be considered foolish. These provinces, as well as that of Smolensk, must be persuaded to cease looking forward to the forest like wolves. In Little Russia, when there is no longer a hetman, efforts must be made to ensure that even the name of hetman disappears.
So, dang. So she's trying to just go all out on these reforms.
And not simply be content with the fact that no one is acceding to this dignity. The newly annexed Polish-Lithuanian lands were merely territories of the Russian Empire, and all particular characteristics were to be suppressed. What's fascinating, however, is that the First Polish Partition made the Russian Empire much more heterogeneous, especially in religious matters, as it gained a very sizable Greek Catholic and Jewish minority.
Basically mean diversity has exploded.
The Greek Catholic or Uniate Church emerged in the late 16th century with the Union of Brest. It was an attempt by the Catholic Church to integrate the Eastern Orthodox in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and was brought about by the Pope and the Metropolitan of Kiev. As a result, the Orthodox were subordinated to the structure and ecclesiastical law of the Catholic Church, but kept their Byzantine Orthodox rituals. By the late 18th century, most had converted to Greek Catholicism, and only small pockets of Eastern Orthodoxy remained. In 1772, Russia gained about 800,000 units, and the question was what should be done about them. In the lead-up to the First Partition, Catherine had stylized herself as a protector of the right of religious minorities.
Right, and this was almost the pretext of why there was so many Russians in Poland-Lithuania prior to the partition.
Poland-Lithuania, which meant that she couldn't simply pursue a policy of religious conversion. Much to the dismay of many Eastern Orthodox clergymen, the Empress instead pursued a careful policy of tolerance and forbade any forced conversions, but she did allow direct conversion from Uniate to Orthodox. But at the same time, a new narrative began to emerge, which would serve as a useful pretext in further imperial expansion. Catherine and her associates increasingly represented the Greek Catholic Church not as a confession, but merely as a trick by the Vatican to lure the Orthodox minorities away from the authority of the Patriarch. More and more, all East Slavs, so Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, were considered by the imperial court to be one people with a common language, culture, history and confession. And
very different, but yeah.
It was St. Petersburg's role to finally reunite these peoples once more after centuries. After the turbulent Second and Third Polish partitions, Catherine launched a period of forcible conversion and confiscated many of the Greek Catholic lands. In the last years of her rule, several hundreds of thousands of people converted to Orthodoxy, especially in the right bank areas of Ukraine. After Catherine's death, her successor, Paul I, stopped the conversion efforts, and a policy of relative tolerance existed until the 1830s. Afterwards, Russia cracked down on dissident Orthodox groups, and all the remaining Uniate monasteries, churches and clergymen were forcibly transferred to Eastern Orthodoxy. From that point on, the Greek Catholic Church only managed to keep existing in Austrian-ruled Galicia and Lodomeria. The story of the Jews who now found themselves in the Russian Empire is particularly interesting as well. Before the Polish partition, no Jew was legally allowed to reside in Russia, but now Catherine had annexed territories which contained tens of thousands of
Yeah, now what do you do with that?
people who practiced Jewish faith. In Catherine's enlightened and absolutist spirit, which judged populations by their usefulness to the state, the Jews were granted religious tolerance and put under the protection of the empress.
Okay. So she has some tolerance. That's good. Well, she's had tolerance, but she's persistent there.
Despite the long-lasting hostile attitude of the Eastern Orthodox Church. In 1772, the Jews of Polotsk found an imperial proclamation attached to the door of their synagogue, which read, "It is understood that the Jewish communities dwelling in the towns and on the lands joined to the Russian Empire retain and preserve those freedoms that they now enjoy by law regarding the control of their property, because the humaneness of Her Imperial Majesty will not permit anyone to be excluded from her all-encompassing generosity and from the welfare to come under her benevolent protection, as long as they, for their part with the appropriate compliance of royal subjects, live and pursue their present trades and businesses according to their callings."
Okay.
Just a few years after the First Partition, Jews were granted the status of townspeople and became able to be elected to their urban governing body. As such, Russia, paradoxically, became the first state in Europe which granted Jews a limited type of emancipation. This, however, caused a series of complaints by Russian merchants who felt
That's a really cool image right here of Red Square.
threatened by their new Jewish competition. In 1791, Russian merchants sent a petition to the Empress complaining that Jewish merchants
What's that big well in the middle?
were exploiting the urban rights granted to them by settling in areas that had belonged to Russia before the partition. Catherine's solution was the creation of the so-called Pale of Settlement. In the late 18th century, Russia had conquered large parts from the Ottoman Empire and now stretched to the Black Sea. In order to populate and develop these new areas, Jews were permitted to immigrate there and still enjoy urban rights. From that point on, a new border existed for the Jews in the Russian Empire. In the west of that border, they were allowed to freely settle and enjoyed extensive rights. To the east of that border, however, they were forbidden from residing. The Pale of Settlement existed until the end of the Russian Empire in 1917 and established long-lasting Jewish demographic patterns that would continue to exist until the Second World War. The Polish king, Stanisław August Poniatowski, had no real choice but to write off the lost land. There was no chance he could regain them back, and the partitioning powers swiftly integrated their new territories, be it through modernization, centralization, or widespread reforms. There was barely any local resistance, and most of the local elites came to terms with their new overlords. An armed uprising was, therefore, completely out of the question. Despite
What arms?
all that, and the hopeless situation that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had found itself in 1773, the king refused to give up. Because, how does today's Polish national anthem put it so beautifully, Poland is not yet lost. After Russia became embroiled in another war against the Ottomans and the Swedes, the king seized the opportunity and set in motion a comprehensive program of reforms. This culminated on the 3rd of May 1791 in Europe's first written constitution, which was a huge milestone and finally freed the aristocratic republic from its political stagnation. However, these successes were short-lived, as Prussia and Russia viewed those developments with suspicion. They subsequently sparked a civil war against the new reforms and declared them null and void. This was followed in 1793 by the Second Partition of Poland, another opportunistic land grab. But we will deal with this history in the next episode, in which we will take a closer look at the 1791 constitution and how it was thwarted by the partitioning powers.
What a video. Go subscribe, by the way, to Sir Manatee. But overall, my brain is fried. My brain is fried in a good way. We'll leave it at that. We'll talk more later. I appreciate you guys so much. Peace out and bye-bye.